All right, it's 2 past the hour. We're going to kick things off. Thanks everyone for joining us, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. This is Sentry's first workshop of 2021. We're happy you're here. Today's topic, as you already know, is going to be on grouping and fingerprinting errors. Just some quick technical housekeeping. Well, first, let's pop through the agenda, and then we'll go through the housekeeping. First, we're going to see how grouping works in Sentry. And then we're going to look at how to improve stack trace grouping. Then we'll take a peek at server-side and SDK-side fingerprinting before getting to your questions and answers at the end. And onto that technical housekeeping now. If you do have those questions, as usual, put them in the QA feature. If you see something that you want to ask that's already been asked, use the upvote thumbs up icon. We will be sending out a timestamped recording of the content today. As always, it's going to be really easy for you to rewatch it or jump to a particular section. And last thing, there's a 1-question survey. It will take you 2 seconds to answer at the end of this workshop. It's going to open your browser. Would really appreciate it if you answered it so we can make future workshops even better. That's everything I had. I'm going to now jump to introduce our host today, Armin Ronacher, who is the Director of Engineering at Sentry. Armin, I'll pass it over to you for the good stuff.
Hello, hello. So, hold on. So I will walk you through various different parts about how grouping works at Sentry in the product and also with some ideas of where we're going to go with it. So I did a Sentry CLI send event, which is basically similar to capture message in any Sentry SDK. And in addition, what I have here is I have a very simple project for Python. So we're going to use Python for most of the rest, where I just set up some buggy applications so we have something to play with. So the events that I sent in, they will appear here in this project that they're working with. And here we can see there's a very simple hello world event that we have received now. And I'm also going to send sort of a basic error in from the Python SDK. And then we can see at different types of errors. So the most important thing about grouping is that Sentry really takes into account various different types of the event and depending on the type of the event. So this here is what's called the message event. And a message event is always grouped by a variation of this message here. So if you look down here into the details, you can see that the grouping algorithm really took this entire message in. And this is what it grouped by. When we go in and, for instance, look at the Python event that we have here, then in comparison, you can see that here the event grouping information tells me it was grouped by the exception stack trace. And that's generally what Sentry will optimize for, is it always will pick a stack trace that has one. And then here, if we unfold this, you can see each individual line that fed into this. All right, so since this is a Python event, we can see that it took all of those purple values and fed this into the grouping algorithm. And out of this, it produced this grouping hash. So every event that shares this hash will go into the same group. There's also additional stuff that it didn't include. So if you go on all values, you can see that file names, for instance, didn't play a role here. And also the value of the error was ignored. So you can always go to here to figure out like why events go together and don't go together. So this is the exception that we created here. So this is a very basic example program. It tries to load some JSON. And when it fails doing that, it will capture an exception, right? And so it sends some extra stuff around. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to, so in this case, you can see the error that was produced was the file doesn't exist. I'm also going to tell it to load an invalid JSON file. And what we will get out of this here is that effectively we get 2 errors eventually when it's finished processing. We will have one group that's sort of the file not found error because we didn't manage to load a JSON file, and we have a second one, is JSON decode error, right? So there might be, these for Sentry are considered to be 2 separate groups, but you might want to just say like, oh, it's the same. So one way in which you can accomplish this is you can basically take these 2 and say like, please merge. That's sort of one way. That will give you basically a group combining both of them. And so if these errors continue happening, they will go into one group. Another way in which you can do this is you can basically set up custom rules both on the server and in the SDK to customize this behavior. So the first thing we'll look into is going to be basically a small improvement to how the error renders. So if you look here, one of the most important parts in which you can improve your Sentry grouping experience is reduce the total amount of stuff that's being considered for an error. So in this case, we intentionally set up this project in a way where Sentry's default, what we call in-app detection, doesn't work correctly. So what you can see here is that we basically have here a main file, and then we have a utility file. And one of the things we can do is we can basically tell it to consider this line or this line to be not part of the main application code. What I'm going to do here now is I'm going to quickly show this on a second project that I have here, which is a small little web application. So this is a web application that if you go to this page here, users, hold on. Depending on how often you run this, it's going to produce an internal server error. Because I have basically a little bug in there that fails this loading. And if we go here into our main project, you can see that there will be another error, have been sent, database unavailable. And as you can see here, we can already see an overview page, but you can also see it here. There's a lot of frames in here, right? And there's the Flask framework is included. And this is part of how this project is set up at the moment. So the first thing we can do is we can basically tell it to really only consider our project to be part of the stack trace. So the way we can do this is we basically go to the project settings, and you will find a tab here called issue grouping. And here you can add custom rules. And so one of these rules, and that's sort of the first ones we're going to look into, is called the stack trace rules. The stack trace rules allow me to influence the stack trace processing in Sentry, and that's both going to have a positive visual impact, but it's also going to have a positive grouping impact. Because basically what you have to consider is that on this frame here, if you look into what is considered part of the group, it's basically every single frame, right? So if any one of those changes, the group will be different. So what we want to do here is we basically want to say like anything that comes from our virtual env really is not application code. So I can do stack.apps path, and then here I can do a glob match where I say like anything in my virtual env is not app. Minus app means please never consider this for application code. When I save this, the Sentry's event processing now has been reconfigured. As future events will come in, they will apply this rule and they will use it as part of the event processing. Due to how the event processing works currently at Sentry, there is a small delay for this rule to take into effect, right? So you might have to wait up to, I would say, about a minute for this rule to apply. But as we run this again, we should basically, I'm going to open this in a separate tab just so that we see the difference. If we keep hitting this error, we will see that, I'll go here, just wait until the new events come in. We will basically then start to see once the rule takes into effect, which I hope is going to be soon, that the stack trace looks a little bit different. So in this case, it didn't apply yet, so we're going to go back to this afterwards. But you will see a visual differentiation here, where it will basically hide all of these Flask frames and will only show you these two application frames first. And that's going to have the effect that whatever changes within the Flask code, it never affects your grouping. So it's generally recommended to hide as many frames as possible out of the main application code so that both you have a decluttered visual view of the most important frames only, but also that it doesn't negatively influence the grouping. So I'm just going to hit a few more here so that we'll eventually see what it's going to do to our grouping. While we're waiting for this, we can basically look into this other example again that we did, where we basically here looked into our small little JSON example, right? So we have here two errors, JSON decode error and file not found error, and we want to do something with it. Just to customize how the grouping works. And in this case, we will not really necessarily want to reduce the noise, but we want to influence how it groups, just as an experiment. So What we can see here now is the default grouping happened, but we want to change the default grouping. And here are some ways in which you can do this. And for this, we're going to go into our what's called custom fingerprinting configuration. So in this case, for instance, what we can do here is we can say in our fingerprint rules that if a certain condition is met, we want to override the grouping entirely, right? So we don't just want to influence the frames so that we exclude certain frames from grouping. We actually want to go in and tell it to completely change the grouping. So for instance, one of the things we can do here is we can just say, well, really anything that happens in this load JSON function here, we want this to group together. So we can, for instance, say stack.function load JSON goes into one group that we call JSON error. This will now cause that any future errors that are being sent in, I'm just going to quickly do this with one type of error here and then the other type of error here. They will then, as they appear in the product, go into the same group. So let's see if we see this appear here. In the meantime, see if this applied. So now we can see that this, what we did earlier, this database unavailable, this looked like this before, right? So you can see this entire stack trace here with all the frames equivalent. And now, because our rule has in the meantime applied, future events really only show us our utility code, our web code, and everything from the framework is kind of hidden underneath. If you go to full, you will see this. And the effect of this is that when you look into your grouping information, there is now an in-app grouping applied, which really only takes a much smaller set of values into account for the grouping algorithm. So let's see in the meantime if I find my event on the overview page here. Right, so here I have this event. This is now a JSON decode error. And if we go to the older event, we can actually see that this was the file not found error, right? So we have two events that are completely different in the same group now. And the reason this happens is because if you go all the way to the bottom, we can see that our load JSON fingerprint rule matched and routed us into this new fingerprint called JSON error. So any event now that has the same fingerprint will actually end up in this group. So I could make a completely different error and it will still end up in this group. This basically allows me to force a lot of independent things into one group. So a very common example is, for instance, API calls. So if you, for instance, you use a library to call into an external service like Slack, or you just want to send a webhook and it could spiral into all kinds of errors, DNS resolution, IO, whatever. You could use this to say like, okay, anything really that happens in this sort of section of the code base, I just want to force into one group. Even if they're of completely different type, I just want to accumulate them all. And then, for instance, use Sentry's discover feature to dig into the details of that group rather than being in the errors product to just investigate this group. But when you do something like that, very often you discover that your group actually turns into a massive group that's going to give you very little insight into what happens. And so maybe you actually want to go in and customize this group based on some conditions. So for instance, you could say like, well, I still want to have all of those errors, all of those JSON errors, for instance, accumulated into one group, but I would then like to split this group by some other condition. So for instance, maybe I want to split this group by the server that the code is running on, because that has some significance for me. And so this is something we're going to do here. I basically configured the SDK to send two custom tags. One of them is called machine, which is basically going to be my server host name. I'm just going to make this up here now. And then a second tag, which is called JSON file. It's just the file name. So if we look here, we can see that in this case, we tried to load this JSON file with this file name. And then we have this machine name here called machine-1. We don't actually need to send the custom machine name because the SDK will also send the server name. But I just wanted to demonstrate this works with any tag that we're going to send. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to go back into our issue grouping settings. And I'm going to change this rule that whenever we match on this load JSON function, we don't just group it, route it into the JSON error group. We actually want to also interpolate the value. In this case, we want to use the, I think we called it machine. Let's quickly check this machine tag in here. So if, sorry, text.machine. right? So now it groups into JSON error plus this information, which will basically create me one group per machine, basically for all the JSON errors. The downside of this now is they're going to look very much the same, right? So how am I going to tell them apart? And so one way in which you can do this is you can basically also define a custom title. So in this case, we will say JSON error on text.machine, right? So if we save this now, for future events, and I'm going to just send a bunch in. So this is the invalid file. This is another one that's just a non-existing file. We will then see on our, just need to find a better way to manage my tabs here. As it's going to be processed, we will see it appear still a couple of minutes ago. So here we can now see that there's JSON error on machine 1. And if I go in, I basically have all these errors in that happened in this code base. And one thing also of note is that both stack trace rules and fingerprinting rules can apply at the same time. So for instance, if I were to have some custom code in a virtual env now in my stack trace, even though we didn't end up grouping by stack trace, this rule still applied and improved my stack trace, right? So I can have both at the same time. But the moment a custom fingerprint rule runs, it's going to win. And we can look at this because if we go down here into our custom fingerprint rule, we can see that, well, this load JSON rule matched with these conditions, and this is what it did. And then you can see these were the values it generated. So it extracted JSON error, which is the first part of it, and then it also extracted machine 1 from the tags. And all of these were then folded into a custom grouping hash, and then again merged again into one group. And because we can customize the rendering of the title, you will also see that it displaces what's normally there, right? Under normal circumstances, you would see the exception type here. But in this case, we have the custom title here. So when you then are in the situation where you have a custom title that overrides the default one, you can still find the original information underneath on the error page, so you can actually tell what those things are. Yeah, so that's sort of the main ideas of how you're going to customize the grouping from the server, right? Because when you do it from the server, you don't have to change your code to influence the grouping. So if you, for instance, see there's a lot of stuff going on in your project, and you would really like to spend some time improving the grouping, you don't actually have to go into your code and customize this. We're going to look later how you can do it from the code. So you don't have to configure it in a UI, but these are going to be complementary ways in which you can influence this. Generally, my recommendation is to try to influence as much as possible from the configuration in the project when it's sort of overarching in sort of different parts of the code base, and you want to do this as part of your triaging workflow. But to do it in the SDK side, if you're ready at the time where you emit a custom message, for instance, you're already aware that you want to force things to group in a certain way. But we're going to look at this later. So since we basically have this now, we can also sort of merge them all together into one massive group if we want. So I'm going to just demonstrate that you can merge these issues, and then they're going to end up to be in one group together, and even the even the code that wouldn't match would still feed into this for as long as it produced a regular grouping hash. So now I want to go back to our web application and have it running a little bit and show you one of the quick wins you can get if you spend some time working on your grouping for sort of real world problems that you have. So this app that I showed you here, basically when you hit the /users endpoint, every once in a while it produces an error because the database is down. And this is an unhandled error in the application. So we see it here, right? It's an unhandled error, database unavailable. And we can see here that it happened on the list users transaction, right? But this is not the only one. I could go to one of those users, and now it happens here too, right? And so under default grouping logic and Sentry, those are considered to be independent instances of an error, right? So I now have basically a database unavailable for show user, and I have one for list user. And so we covered earlier, I can group them together with custom fingerprints. And the reason this is really, really useful is because you have certain types of errors where you just know they are global, but Sentry itself cannot understand this. So for instance, if you have a very centralized service in your infrastructure, like a database, or you have Redis, a caching system, if you can identify where those types of errors are, you can really force them together to, when you have a massive downtime, don't actually have a massive list of those errors appearing in your project, because you will have them neatly contained within one group. So for as long as you can identify sort of these global errors in your code base, you're good. So I'll quickly look into how we can do this. Again, it's sort of the same as before, but instead of matching on the stack, we can now match on the error. So in this case, we know the error type here is always database unavailable. So if we take this, just copy this in, we can say like database is down or something. Now all the errors that have this type will be forced into a single group. So I'm going to delete this now just to demonstrate what this looks like. And we're going to hit a bunch of errors here. And then we're going to hit a bunch of errors here as well. Then eventually we'll see, once it starts processing in the pipeline, that there's one big group now, which has all of the errors in. One of the ways in which Sentry works, it's as it's processing events in the system, it's going to take some time for these to show up, right? It's processed them instantly, but it might flush them out with the delay of a couple of seconds in a massive like batch of errors that are sort of similar in type. And because, for instance, now we have both the show user error and the list user error in this database unavailable one, you can see that only the last one really shows up here, right? It shows show user, even though if you go into it, there will actually be list users too, right? In this case, an event came in afterwards that overrode it again. One way to find out what's actually contained within this type of group would be to go to the events view, the tags view, where you can then see the different values that fed into it. So we can see that in this group that we forced together, 3 events were from show user and 2 events were from list user, right? So there are ways for you to see what of the content of this group is, even as you force it together. Yeah, so that's sort of the basics of what you can really do on the server. So next question is like, how can you discover what you can do with this? So I introduced the 2 big concepts, fingerprinting rules and stack trace rules. Both of them are documented in the documentation. You can follow the link here. And this here, for instance, is all the rules that you can do on stack traces. So for instance, if you are a C++ project, it's a very common thing that you have namespaces in front of your functions. You can, for instance, use this to automatically force all of the functions in std : and then like anything afterwards to be definitely not part of your application. Likewise, if you do a lot of JavaScript, a very simple way for you to is force everything in node modules out of your application. That's normally already the case. The SDKs will attempt to configure this out of the box for you. But there are cases where it can slip through, particularly if source maps are involved, or you have more complex setups, or maybe it's not called node modules, maybe it's called something else like vendor. In-app, not in-app is basically it removes it from grouping, but it also hides it in the UI. If you think it, you still want to see it by default, it's part of your application code, but you don't want it to be considered for grouping, you can also say like, oh, please don't group it, right? In that case, it will basically say like, I'm going to ignore it for grouping, but I'm still going to show it to you by default. There are all kinds of matches available. You can really find a lot of this in the documentation. But there are also some examples of what you can do with this that are more powerful, that really give you a very good experience if you have an application that behaves in a certain way. This is particularly useful for C++, for instance. If you, for instance, have a function that is sort of basically the top of your stack trace all the time, it might be that you know that this is the top, and I don't want to see anything above, even if the frames are above are kind of random. So for instance, you can then say, if the function always has like begin panic at the top, I want to never show this and I want to never group on it. Likewise, if the bottom of your function, of your stack trace is always the same, like for instance, it's an event loop, or it's the thread start method, you can also say like anything underneath this should be ignored. So I will just show you what this would look like. You could basically have a rule where you say like, if my stack function is spawn thread, for instance, there might be something underneath that you don't want to see. You can say everything down from here is not application code, and this is also not application code, right? The V means downwards, and the circumflex means towards. So this goes towards the crash, this goes away from the crash. So there are many different ways in which you can experiment with this. To see how these stack trace rules apply, you can go on an event where this has been done. So we should actually see it here. And you can then go on show details. And when you see, in this case, we don't actually group by the application stack trace because the custom fingerprint overrode it, we can still look at what it did. And so for instance, you can see that this was marked out of app by stack trace rule, right? So you can see the rule that we have in our configuration settings, and you can see it's like this applied, and it was marked out of app. So you can sort of debug this experience here and get a better idea of how it works. Overall, it's a very powerful system, and it requires you some time to experiment with it. But if you're suffering under a lot of alert noise or something like this, it's really worth diving into the possibilities that the system gives you. So this is as far as you can go on the server side, right? There's a lot of documentation available for you to explore all those different ways in which you can do it. But there's also possibilities for you to influence what happens on the client side. So for instance, we're going to remove this rule now that we created, if I find it, that forces everything to be into one group for the database unavailable. And we're going to try to accomplish the same on the client. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my web project. And here I want to use a feature in the SDK called before send to influence what happens with an event. So you can at any point in time register a function called before send, and this works relatively the same in all SDKs, which gets two parameters. It gets the event, which is the event is about to be sent, and it gets an object called the hint object, which contains additional information you can use to influence the event. So for instance, you can say in Python that I want to check if the event was created from an exception. For that, you can look into this hints dictionary if there's an exception information in there. And you can say if there is exception information and the second value of the exception information is of type database unavailable, you can do something, right? So one of the things that you could do here is you could throw away the entire event. If you don't want to see database unavailable errors, just throw it away. Then you would just return none, and Sentry would never send these errors again. But that's not what you want to do here. We just want to change the grouping. So what you can do is you can basically go and modify the event. And in the same way as here, on the bottom, we send some fingerprint values databases down from a rule. We can do the same thing here. So we can say fingerprint is a list of values. In this case, we can say databases down, right? So we're going to do the same as here. We're going to save it. And we're going to reload our application. And now if we trigger this error again, let's see what shows up. So far, I haven't seen it. So now we saw it once. Let's see if it comes up again. We should see the same thing here now, where all of those errors go in to this one group. Let's see when it shows up. All right, so it's still in the same group. But this time, if you go to the details, you can see that it was hard-coded by the client SDK, right? So previously, we saw the rule that applied to change the fingerprint. In this case, the fingerprint was set by the client code. So we see no rule here that applied, but we can see the custom fingerprint that we configured. you can not only configure the custom fingerprint in a before send method, although for these types of errors, it's a very convenient way to do it. Another way, for instance, is to say, well, I want to reconfigure this here right away. So I could, for instance, say on scope, so this is an example where I configure the scope manually. I want to say set fingerprint, and then I can say JSON error, right? And if I do this, any exception flying in the duration of this block is going to be grouped by the string called JSON error. So I can demonstrate this again if I do just some errors here. Oh, actually, sorry, it's in Python, it's called fingerprint equals. If I do this, they're all going to go to the same group. So this is actually me misusing the SDK, so I don't have to keep this. Let's see when the event comes up. All right, so in this case, I don't actually, oh yeah, in this case, we can actually now see that both applied, both the server and the client. So in this case, you can see now that the server applied this rule and forced it into this group. In addition, we can also see that the client tried to send the JSON error fingerprint, but the server rule always overrides the client rule. So in this case, we can see the server rule won. And so what I did on the client didn't actually take any effect. But you get the idea. You can configure this both on the client and on the server. And depending on how you're going to do this, there are different ways in which you can see this. What I want to give you sort of as general recommendations of how you can use the system is the most annoying, I think, experience that people have when they use the product without thinking too much about grouping is if they have code that can error in many different ways. So this is particularly communication with external services, where the external services might legitimately cause failures. So for instance, if you have a system that sends out notification emails every morning on a cron job, and some of those mail sending activities fail in different types of errors, it's very common that if you just deploy the system to Sentry, you're going to get a bunch of different groups based on the different errors that you're going to experience. There are two ways in which you can go with this. One of them is like, okay, I don't want to see this at all, but that's kind of not great because then you don't know that something is failing and you still might want to monitor this. The other one is to force this to be in a consistent group. And when you force something in a consistent group, a lot of customers then think that there's no way for them to discover what's inside of this. So one way, as I showed you, is to use the tags feature to actually see the different types of things that fed into this. So for instance, here we can see like the different JSON files that cause this error to happen. But another way is actually to use a discover feature to do something similar. So for instance, here we can search for all of the event title. Let's see what we actually have. So we can do, it's just for database unavailable. So you can search here, for instance, and then you can, so in this case, I can't do it because actually on my project here, I'm not on a business plan. But if you are on a business plan, you can change the column rendering here, for instance, to break it down by a transaction, for instance. Then you can get a nice breakdown of what my database unavailability looks like. So for instance, maybe if I break it down by the server name, I see that one server is having more database unavailable errors than others. And so in that case, actually grouping this down consistently into one big group also helps you then fan it out into a good breakdown in Discover based on the different sort of areas in which you want to investigate why this error is happening. Likewise, if you do calls to external services, a good idea is to always attach a tag, which service it is. And then you can use, even if it's in a single group, you can use the Discover product to figure out which service is failing in how many ways. That's pretty much all I have. And I think with that, we can go to questions and answers.
Great. Thanks, Armin. I'm going to let you keep the screen share just in case one of the questions that comes in asks you to show something. So let's go through the list here. We'll start at the top. First question was, what does type component mean in the grouping information?
Yes, so that's actually something I should probably have shown. So when the grouping algorithm comes in, it goes into different ways. So the most common one is that you will encounter if you do something yourself will be custom fingerprint, which basically we're going to use what you configured. The other one is sort of all the built-in ones. They come in two forms. One of them is called component, which is basically the system took a part of your stack trace or a part of your event and generated out of that structure the inputs to the grouping algorithm. So in this case, for instance, you can see that the component is a system exception stack trace. So it went through all the frames of the stack trace of the exception to extract all of those values and use that as an input for the grouping algorithm. There's actually a second part, which is called the salted component. And I actually should probably show this because it's really quite a nice feature. If you, for instance, are really satisfied with the default grouping, but you just want to subdivide it into smaller groups, you can also say, based on some rule, for instance, if the I don't know, if the event type is database unavailable, let's do this. Database unavailable. You can also say like, okay, just keep the default grouping algorithm. I'm actually happy to see it depending on where it is, but I want to subdivide it also by the machine, right? So in this case, you would get all the default grouping behavior plus it also being subdivided by the machine. And then you would get more groups. Sorry, this is error type. You would get more groups, but that might be what you want in a certain case, right? So these are the different types of inputs that come into it. Because the grouping algorithm by default runs a lot of these different component matchers, a lot of them, if you go into the details, will not be taken into effect. So for instance, here, because a custom fingerprint was used, both of the exception stack trace and the only in-app exception stack trace, they were both unused because of custom fingerprints takes precedence. Likewise, even here, individual bits and pieces might individually not apply.
Cool. Next question. Are the stack trace rules applied per project? So say one has multiple projects.
Yes, they are project local.
Great. Someone was asking for references to the docs. Let me chat that out real quick to everyone so you have that. There you go.
They are also linked directly in the settings from the rules index. There's always a link that takes you there.
Great. Looks like this one was already answered, but we'll just ask it out loud again. Will previous events that this rule would have applied to be grouped separately from events after the rule was changed? It looks like they would only apply to future events. Is that right?
That is correct. So at the moment, the grouping system only applies to future events. It's relatively tricky to change that in how the system works. One recommendation I have is then just to use the merge feature to merge all the old groups into the new group. And that sort of lessens the pain.
Is there a way to override the stack trace grouping?
So there are two ways in which you can override this. One of them is just to use the custom fingerprinting rule. The other one is to influence which stack frames apply, which can add more frames to the stack trace grouping, or it can remove frames from the stack trace grouping. You can also force it to only consider a certain number of events. One thing that, for instance, some native customers really like if they come from other products is that they want to use only 1 or 2 frames for this. So you can, for instance, say like for all native events, like all C, C++, Rust, you only want to use the top 3 frames, right? In this case, for as long as we have C++ events, we only use 3 levels of stack trace instead of the default, which is unlimited.
Okay, let's see. I'm not sure if this question is different from the one we asked earlier. I think it is a little bit different. I'll ask it anyway. Is there a way to group issues across multiple projects?
So if you send the same event into 2 projects, there's no way for you to merge them together because Sentry considers projects to be distinct in a way where you can't merge across them. There is one caveat to this though. If you do use a custom fingerprint, for instance, underneath it produces this grouping hash. And if you are on a business plan, you can actually use Discover to specifically group in the Discover product by this hash, which would permit you to get an aggregate view or breakdown of events across projects and across groups if they share the same hash.
Someone is wondering how this group affects logging issues in Jira. They have a bunch of type errors in different areas. They need to log Jira tickets for all of them. If I use issue grouping, how would that work from a Jira ticketing perspective?
So generally, the groups that are being created in Sentry, they can be associated with external issues like Jira or GitHub. When you manually merge an event in the UI, we will try to update the links as good as possible. We also leave what we call redirect groups behind. So if a group merges and you have a link to the old group, that link will transparently redirect to the new group. If you use stack trace rules or fingerprint rules to force events together, this really only applies to future events. So you will never have had the chance in a way to attach a Jira issue to one of those because it would just create a bigger group. And if you only have one group, there's only one Jira issue or one GitHub issue you can associate with it.
Can you export or import grouping rules that were configured through the UI?
So because this is a text input box, the easiest way at the moment is to copy paste them in and out so you can take them from project to project. There is an undocumented API, and I'm hoping we're going to document them soon, but I know that some customers are already using it based on what the UI is doing to synchronize up the grouping rules from a file and version control. So if you look at what the UI does, it's a simple HTTP request, and you can basically use that with a token to force up specific rules if you want to.
Can you navigate to the affected event when using or looking at the events within the tag column?
So if you are here, for instance, and you break down to this, at the moment, this takes you to a query that is based on what you clicked on, and that gives you a list of these tags. You can also then take this filter and go directly to Discover product to do the same. There is currently no direct way to go to Discover from here, but in a way you can directly go to events. The easiest one is just this one here, where you can pick any of them, for instance, and then say like, give me an example event, and you will find one that has exactly this tag.
How would you recommend handling a situation where Sentry is grouping events that you do not wish to be grouped? I know you went over that a little bit, but for example, if they have a server that makes API calls to different endpoints, they want to consistently separate the errors by the endpoint, not the error type.
So one way is basically subdivision. So I mentioned this briefly, but you can, for instance, say like, if, for instance, I know that this sort of thing happens on stack function, like invoke external service, right? I can say like, okay, I'm definitely satisfied with the default grouping, but I want to subdivide it by something else. If you, for instance, have in the SDK that the endpoint that you're hitting as part of a tag, you can use this here. That's the easiest one. So anything that's in a tag can be used directly. Another relatively common one is SDKs might configure this actually to be the transaction. Then you can directly use the transaction here. But it does require you, at the moment at least, this data to be in the event payload that you can use it for access here. But if you're lucky enough that the SDK already is configured to have a tag for the endpoint, if you do this, it basically uses the default rule but subdivides by the endpoint. So you will have, you will have one event per endpoint. If you do this, my recommendation is also to configure custom title. So in this case, I would then say service error add, and then you can use here again the syntax to say like text.endpoint, and then you will more easily see what's going on.
Great. Can events be grouped by stack trace and message?
So the way this works at the moment is message is generally considered to be a relatively low quality grouping indicator. So if you send an event in, we will try to clean it up a little bit. So for instance, if you have a number in the event, we will attempt to detect that there are numbers and split it out. The default grouping also, if there is a stack trace available, will always disregard the message of the of the error because of how noisy it is and how many different groups it creates. You can bring it back in if you really want to. I will show you this in a second, but just first want to show you that here, for instance, you can see that the number here was automatically detected. So even if I sent like 1111 in, it will still go to the same group because the default server system removed this. What I can do, sorry, let me just go back here. What I can do is I basically can say like, okay, I really want to use the error message. Then you can do error.type, for instance. I want to say like, okay, script invoke error. Maybe that's an error that I know where the message is good. I still want to keep default, but I also further want to subdivide by error.value, for instance, and then it takes the error value into account in addition, right? So this forces the error value to be considered, even if Sentry itself wouldn't consider it.
Cool. In JavaScript, sometimes different browsers will give different error messages for the same error, resulting in different groups. Is there a way around that?
So the error message in itself should not be considered for grouping for as long there is a stack trace. What you often do see, and this is the reason why a lot of JavaScript stack traces are inconsistent across browser versions, is that browsers will produce slightly different stack traces. Sentry attempts to normalize this as much as possible, and we're going to spend quite some time going forward on making this as transparent as possible and normalizing the stacks as much as possible so that you don't get too many groups by default. But the error message should not apply for as long as you have a stack trace. One, I want to say, one thing that you can do to help with this a little bit is if you identify frames that are commonly screwing up the stack trace that you see, to use stack trace rules to remove them. That's the main recommendation I can give in this case at the moment is to consider removing noisy frames from it.
How can one enforce grouping events by message? It seems that when using Sentry.captureMessage, all events are grouped in one, no matter how the message looks.
So this heavily depends on how the SDK is configured. Some SDKs will, when you call capture message, attach the stack trace of the message call to force it to be in the same group, basically. Some SDKs, for performance reasons, will not capture the stack trace. If the SDK captures the stack trace, it forces a group to be attached basically to this location in code where the call is happening. In that case, it's the same solution as the other one. You use a subdivision where if, for instance, you know that the message is always starting with the same thing, for instance, always starts with invalid operation, for instance, you can match on that and say like, okay, I want to keep the default grouping, but I then also want to take the message into account. And it's the same story, then it will actually use the message as an additional input.
And while you're here, how do you modify the default grouping to exclude a specific field from being included in the algorithm?
So the default grouping only ever takes frame information into account. At the moment, there is no way for you to say, I don't want to use certain types of the input. This is something we're investigating, if this is something that makes sense exposing. What I can tell you generally right now is we are going to do some bigger changes and improvements on the grouping system that might make this unnecessary, or we're going to expose functionality like this. But at the moment, you cannot tell it to exclude parts of a frame. You can only tell it to exclude entire frames. That's the only thing we expose at the moment.
Got it. Last one. How do you configure Sentry properly on large clusters of web servers that auto scales? So more context, we've used Sentry on our React.js web app and had some trouble grouping the errors. Every time a new server web instance gets launched, it would create a new group for the same error, and we would need to manually merge them. Seems like because it's a different server, it would have a totally different fingerprint.
Normally, no server local information should be included in the group. It can happen for one reason or another that part of what feeds into the grouping algorithm is causing this to happen. In that case, my recommendation is go to an event, go to the detail panel at the bottom, expand the values that that influence this. So for instance, there might be something in there that actually refers to the pod name on Kubernetes or something like that, and then see if there's a way for you to remove this information. Normally, it shouldn't ever appear in there. The common problem here is things like capture message. Capture message might indirectly refer to a server local information. The other thing that very commonly happens is that on some SDKs, it can happen that the path of the file feeds into the grouping algorithm. So it could be that the file name here actually has the full file name path in it. And what I can tell you here is that we have changed this behavior from, I think, about a year ago, where it included the entire path, to not including the entire path. If you are on a project that has been created before this point in time, you're on an older grouping algorithm than a newer one. What you can do is you can go to your settings, and here there is an update button, which forces you to the latest grouping version, which no longer has this behavior. So if you have that, you can upgrade grouping here. The negative effect of doing that is that events before that upgrade to events after that upgrade are incompatible to each other from a grouping situation. So you will get a lot of new groups. That's why this upgrade does not happen automatically. But if you do find the situation where you see in the grouping debug view that there's stuff in there like file names that are inconsistent, upgrading the grouping strategy is definitely going to fix this problem for you.
And the final one, we had one more come in while you were chatting. How can we tweak grouping so that the same issue moving between line numbers doesn't show up as a new group?
This again, line numbers are no longer considered to be part of the grouping algorithm. This is another case where you're probably in an old grouping version. So upgrading to a new grouping version will no longer take line numbers into account. There is one exception to this rule, which is on SDKs where we really, really trust that the source code information is good and always available. We feed in the source code at the line location. This does mean that if that source code changes, it's going to turn into a new group. But it does mean that if you move code around between files, it doesn't negatively influence the grouping otherwise. One other note is if you see events that don't group well, feel free to reach out to support, because as we're doing improvements to the grouping algorithm, we take all of that information from support channels into account to improve the grouping algorithm going forward.
Awesome. That's all we've got. Everyone, thank you so much for attending. Don't forget, there's a quick one-question survey that'll open up in the browser after in the meeting. Please take that, answer that question. It'll help us make future workshops like this better. With that said, have a good rest of your week. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month for our workshop on JavaScript release health. Thanks, Armin.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.